Hello, my name is Alex, and welcome to Eclectic Eccentrics, a series in which we will be looking at some marvellous and some not so marvellous individuals who have been described as eccentric somewhere along the way. Their stories might delight, terrify, or intrigue you, but they will always entertain. Hello there, welcome, gather round, take a seat, make yourself comfortable with whatever vice and poison you may choose, for we have already reached episode 4 of series 1 of Eclectic Eccentrics, but today is a good one, because today we are focusing on the animal trainer. As you may have noticed from listening to previous episodes of Eclectic Eccentrics, there is certainly a theme when it comes to our eccentric characters, and that is most of them tend to be wealthy sorts, sporting various titles. In this episode, though, this is not the case. No, we are in fact going to have a look at a chap who began life as a humble farmer's son. Jemmy Hirst, that's Jemmy, Jemmy, was born in 1738 to a farming family in Yorkshire, England. From the beginning of his life, it was clear that little Jemmy was not destined for a regular, so-called, normal life. In an attempt to steer him clear of farming, Jemmy's family sent him to school in the hope that he would become one with the cloth. A priest, that is. Jemmy, however, it seems, had other ideas, and he tried everything within his power to avoid the path that his parents wanted for him. To begin with, he trained a jackdaw and a hedgehog to follow him around school, before thinking it would be an excellent idea to ride his schoolmaster's sow around the school grounds. In a final get-stuffed to religion, he took great amusement in continually popping the lenses out of the local priest's glasses. Needless to say, his teachers did not take too kindly to this, and Jemmy was swiftly thrown out. Clearly a lack of forgiveness at that school. Not all was lost, though, as soon after Jemmy was apprenticed to a tanner, who happened to have a daughter. A very nice daughter, also Jemmy thought. They soon fell in love and were engaged to be married. Unfortunately, life is not always fair and is, sometimes, very cruel indeed. After falling into a river, Jemmy's wife-to-be contracted smallpox and died soon after. As we have seen with other eccentrics in this series, this terrible event appeared to be the catalyst for some of Jemmy's most eccentric behaviour. Following a stint, after his wife's death, where Jemmy retired to his bed, allegedly suffering from a brain fever, he focused again on his interest in training animals. The results were interesting, to say the least. As a follower of the local fox hunt, Jemmy evidently decided that he wanted to join in the so-called fun. Not on a horse, however, no, but rather on a bull named Jupiter. Jupiter was duly kitted out as you would expect of a horse, saddle, bridle and all, and was even able to jump fences, and undoubtedly put mere horses to shame. Quite unbelievably, however, Jupiter was arguably not the strangest thing about the hunt, because instead of using hounds, Jemmy used pigs. Joining the local hunt was not Jupiter's first foray into horse-related life either. Initially following his, I suppose, horse induction, Jupiter had been trained to pull a bespoke carriage which Jemmy himself had constructed. The carriage was made of wicker, was said to have had unusually big wheels, and looked like an upside-down lampshade. Jemmy also invented an odometer, and so a bell would ring after every mile. After noticing that Jupiter was struggling to pull the carriage, Jemmy decided to add some sails to his contraption instead. Although this did work, it did not all go to plan, however, as on a visit to Pontefract, Jemmy ended up crashing the carriage into a shop. Unsurprisingly, he was banned from the town. Beyond training bulls and pigs, Jemmy also trained an otter to catch fish for him. The only hiccup was the otter rarely wanted to relinquish control of the fish, which I think is more than understandable. A fan of entertaining, Jemmy had an unusual method for inviting people to his house for tea. You see, he would blow a hunting horn to summon the poor and the elderly to his home before proceeding to serve the refreshments from his favourite coffin. This coffin, once again handmade by Jemmy, had folding doors in which you could look through thanks to 2 glass bull's eyes. There was also a bell, just in case he needed anything when the time came to be buried. When not in use, Jemmy had the coffin propped up against a wall in his home, which guests could stand if they so pleased. Over the businessman, however, Jemmy charged gentlemen a penny for the privilege. Ladies, on the other hand, had to pay, not in cash, but by giving Jemmy a garter, which he would tie to an old armchair, which was soon covered. If the coffin wasn't disconcerting enough, however, Jemmy's house was also decorated in old rope and iron which hung from the walls. All sounds a bit menacing, doesn't it? Suppose you got a free cuppa out of it, mind. It was not just the poor and the elderly who Jemmy entertained, however. As his reputation grew, largely because of his eccentric behaviour, he caught the attention of a certain King George III, who invited Jemmy to London. Instead of leaping at the opportunity to meet the king, Jemmy wrote back explaining that he was busy training his otter to fish, but he would think about it and would maybe come later. It took several summons from the king before Jemmy finally accepted the invite. Now, if you're meeting a king, you have to make the effort, especially when it comes to clothing. Jemmy, however, it's fair to say, had a very unique taste in his garb. For example, he had previously attended Doncaster races wearing a lambskin hat with a 9-foot brim and a waistcoat formed of duck feathers. So when it was time for Jemmy to visit the king, you just know he was going to rock up in something special. His outfit of choice was formed of patchwork breeches, red and white striped stockings, a coat made of otter pelts, and a pair of yellow boots to round the look off. During the visit, a noble, clearly tickled by Jemmy's attire, burst into laughter. Believing the man was suffering from hysterics, Jemmy threw a goblet of water in his face to calm him down. It is not clear whether the king and Jemmy got along. However, King George obviously impressed Jemmy, who described him as a plain-looking fellow and ended up inviting the king to his house for a good brandy. Reportedly, the king politely refused this invite. Maybe Jemmy should have used his horn. But he did end up giving Jemmy several bottles of wine from the royal cellar. Maybe they did get on well after all. Jemmy did eventually marry, following the death of his previous betrothed. The ceremony, as you would perhaps expect, was anything but usual. For example, at Jemmy's insistence, the ceremony was conducted in sign language, while Jemmy himself wore a toga for the occasion. The woman he married was his former housekeeper, however, so you'd like to think she knew exactly what she was marrying into. Jemmy Hirst died in 1829. As part of his will, he left £12 to 12 old maids who were to follow his coffin mourning. He also requested that a fiddler and a bagpiper attended proceedings and that they only play happy songs. Unfortunately, only 2 maids turned up. The priest only allowed the piper to play the song "O'er the Hills and Far Away," and the fiddler was banned from playing at all. Perhaps the priest was getting his own back after learning of Jemmy's childhood pranks. The church, however, did source an additional 10 mourning maids. At the time of his death, Jemmy also had an accountant, who was not forgotten about, as Jemmy left him a piece of rope so he could hang himself. Lovely. Jemmy was buried in Rawcliffe churchyard, though no evidence of his grave remains. It is believed he was, therefore, likely buried with his parents, whose graves are still intact. For those of you that fancy a Jemmy Hirst pilgrimage, there is a pub in Rawcliffe dedicated to him, called Jemmy Hirst at the Rose and Crown. By all accounts, it's a very decent pub. And there we have it, listeners. We have come to the end of episode 4. The fantastical Jemmy Hirst, an eccentric who, perhaps, in some way, broke the mould. I am already looking forward to welcoming you all back to the next episode, which will be our penultimate episode of the series. It's going to be a good one. So for now, tally ho, and goodbye.